Good afternoon. Hope everybody's having a great time here at AFA. My name's Melanie Allen. I work for the Ralph C. Hagen Corporation as well as part of the Hagen Aviculture Research Institute team. I'm going to introduce the next speaker. Ta-da! I want to say a few words about this individual because when I first met her, the most memorable thing, other than the fact that it's the hair, was that this is a person who is extremely passionate about everything that has to do with companion bird, whether it is breeding, aviculture, conservation network. She just instills and inspires on a continuous basis. And that was 19 years ago. Yeah, we're getting old. Anyway, it is my very extreme pleasure to introduce Josee Bermingham, who is the manager of the Hagen Aviculture Research Facility. She is a vet tech. She is also in charge of all of our quality control at Hagen with regards to our bird products, especially our bird food. And she's done a lot advancing our research facility with the Canadian government with projects in research and development and everything. So, again, I hope she inspires everybody here.
Okay, so the topic today is definitely one of my most passionate topics because I regrettably had Moluccan cockatoos 20 years ago that suffered from hormone overdrive. And at that time, I wasn't really aware of all of the contributing factors that I had unconsciously done over the years. And so I thought it was going to be a cool thing to present today with a lot of risk factor involved because there's a lot of people that are going to have their feathers ruffled by me today. And we have to say it out how it is. There's no polite way of saying how things should be, I think, when it comes around to ensuring that our birds can actually survive as companion birds in our homes forever. And so this is what we're going to be talking about today, how hormones affect the potential longevity of these birds, both health-wise and also behaviorally in your homes. We raise birds now. We're up to our third generation at our facility, captive bred, and most of them are parent raised. And of course, we allow some of the birds to be completely hand raised at times. And to be honest with you, we have both success with parent raised as we do with our hand raised birds. But we would have thought that 3 generations down the road, we would have less health issues because of all the advancements that we've done, that the avian community has done with medicine and with exploratory surgery and with understanding of what birds require, as well as the safer products and nutrition out there and the accessories and everything that's manufactured for birds should make it that these birds are actually living longer in our care. Unfortunately, we have missed a big point, and that usually always comes back to the hormones that we see in captivity and how these are affecting our birds health-wise. Unfortunately, when people have problems with behavior with their birds, they tend to seek advice from a behaviorist, which is a good thing. But unfortunately, the first place that we should look is also for medical attention. Most of the time, the underlying problems with behavioral issues are usually hormonal, especially when the birds have reached a later stage of the fledgling age, which would be maybe 1.5 years for a macaw, maybe 7 months for a Quaker parakeet. These problems start to arise. I have a 15-year-old and a 13-year-old boy at home, and they're hormonally charged right now. But I'm very happy I don't have any girls. My boys are dealing very well with it because they're extremely busy. Their lives are fulfilled and enriched, and they don't have much time to get all out of whack with their hormones, so it's a good thing for me. But there's many things that I try and do with my boys that we've done with our birds over the years, and we'll be trying to this talk is not about how hormones are actually developed in the body. This is too medical, and I didn't want to go there because that's not going to be useful for you. What this is mainly about is what you're doing and how this is having a direct consequence on your birds. life expectancy is much shorter than what it used to be. In the previously published Harrison, maybe 20 years ago, a cockatiel's life expectancy was already down to 5 years. And when we show this page in the Harrisons, people are always shocked to see that Amazon's life expectancy were down to 12 years. And I have a feeling it's even lower now in this day and age. And despite the fact that they're captive bred and they're healthier and we don't have the problems that we used to with, aspergillus and psittacosis and all of the older diseases. But the birds are suffering from 3 main conditions. And we're not going to talk about now PDD and viruses and stuff. But what our birds are mainly suffering with is obesity, lack of exercise, and hormones. And the 2 first ones, of course, our children are suffering from. But the last one is very particular to birds for many different particular reasons. We're going to be discussing now, and I hope it's not going to be too confusing because we're going to go through a lot of things very rapidly. And we'll bring them back at the end and we'll try and make a statement as far as what you should be doing in my perspective. But the major categories that we'll be talking about is what you're doing nutritionally, what you're doing environmentally, what you're doing with the behavior of the bird, both your bird's behavior and your behavior towards the bird, and what kind of lifestyle you're actually offering these birds in captivity. Now, we're not going to be talking about birds that have issues with their endocrine system. We're not going to be talking about birds that are unhealthy because they have a tumor or growth on their testicles or their ovaries, and this is causing unusual behaviors and health problems. We're going to be talking about really, really healthy birds. And so that's going to eliminate a lot of variables here. Now, when we were talking just a few minutes ago about life expectancy, for sure it's very different for males and females. The reason why females' life expectancy is lowered because of hormones has a lot to do with the fact that they get complications with ovarian activity, especially since they're obese and they're under exercise, and we'll explore that. When it comes around to looking at the largest rescues in the world, it's very easy to see how many males wind up there. And for the males, it's not really their life expectancy that's at risk as much as the fact that they're losing their forever homes because they get extremely territorial. And so which one is worst? I think they're equally as dangerous. These birds that become extremely hormonal that cannot be replaced in another home, or they do so for a little bit of time because it's always fun when they move into a new home and they haven't set up their territory yet, but soon the territoriality starts up again and they become comfortable again and they start the same pattern, and then the new bird is not so fun anymore. So this is what we're going to be talking about now. Now, what's very important as well is I'm going to make a huge emphasis on the importance of knowing the gender of your birds. And I'm a breeder, and I've been breeding birds for several years, almost 30 years now. And we have to be very innovative at Hari because we only feed extruded pellets, which is really boring. So we have to find all kinds of other enrichments for our birds to be stimulated to breed. So we know what stimulates birds to breed. We definitely know how to do that when we're breeders. Most of the people that are here that breed birds all have their own little secret tricks, and we know how to do that. But it seems that when we're speaking to a crowd of parrot owners that are companion parrot owners, they're almost like ostriches putting their heads in the sand. They fail to recognize the symptoms. They don't want to see them because that would mean that they would be forced to change their ways, which is what makes them happy as caretakers in the first place. And so it's always more difficult for us to speak to companion parrot owners. It's often more easy for a companion parrot owner to be told that your hormonal female could be put on Lupron, an injection, to reduce the hormonal outburst, instead of them trying to make an effort to reduce all the other things that they're doing, because those things are fun and they want to keep that relationship with their bird. So I'm not going to be talking about medication. I don't believe that that's the first thing you should do. I think that's definitely the decision of your veterinarian to decide that along with you. And if you're not willing to make the sacrifices that I'm going to be talking about right now, then that might be your only option to save their lives, and that's okay. But this is not what this is going to be about. When we're talking about health being compromised by hormonal states that usually last not just seasonally but year-round because of the perfect conditions that we give our companion birds, we're talking about very serious medical conditions. Now, the ones that we hear less about are prolapses. It was spoken about earlier today. when we were talking, the veterinarian was talking about the cloaca and how the droppings can be reflective of a bird's hormonal status. But the prolapse of the cloaca is very common. It used to be very common with cockatoo owners because, of course, cockatoos are clingers. They're Velcro birds. And usually owners of cockatoos overindulge in preening these birds and into petting them in the wrong ways. So that was very, very common. In the 1980s, we would see so many cockatoos with this condition. We would also see pygostyle, which I didn't write on here, but is another condition where the vent actually gets a lesion right on top of the vent because the birds are always dilating their cloaca and the skin is not very elastin. And this is also another condition that's similar to a prolapse and has the same consequences because they're very hard to take care of medically wise. The injuries near the vent is not that uncommon, but people rarely inspect their birds near the vent. It's not something that people commonly do. Most people cannot handle their birds easily, and so to inspect the skin around the vent is not something that they would think to do. But birds do masturbate on objects, and it's not that they shouldn't, but we have to be careful what's in their environment when they start to do so. Females, of course, the most popular thing that we all know about hormones is that females can suffer from complications with eggs. And everybody now is thinking right away, you know, that it's always an egg stuck in the oviduct. But I will shock you that it is most commonly, in what we see in Canada, most commonly it's not even to the point where the egg is stuck in the oviduct. It's prior to that where the birds actually have problems with the ovaries and with the follicles and the immature egg actually falling beside the oviduct because the birds are not healthy. So there's a lot more than just actually having an egg that you can see on an x-ray. There's a lot more complications than that. Feather damaging behavior, that's all people talk about sometimes in conferences. We get so many questions about that. Most people think it's boredom and it's related to nutrition, but it's often related to hormones. And we pride ourselves in the quality of feathers that we have in our colony at Harry, but when we have young individuals that are stressed in the environment that they're in, the first thing that we're going to recognize is that usually the females start to do feather damaging behavior. And then they will have it around the crop and they'll have it around the hips here. And usually the females get started first, and then I don't know if the males just learn that it's a fun thing to do, but usually the males mimic that and they continue. But these are the things that we usually see with the females. Stress is something that's definitely underestimated as well. Hormonal stress is not normal. In the wild, they have 2 seasons usually when they will get reproductively hormonally driven, and it's not year-round. So this is very important to understand as well. And depression, especially if there's nothing they can do about it. This is something that can become extremely affecting their health as well. Now, I put cockatoos there, and we all know why, because when they get aggressive and territorial, they're notorious for it. Breeders stopped breeding them for years because they would just kill off their females all the time. Very complicated to set up an aviary for them. But as pets as well, I mean, I got bitten by my Moluccan cockatoo after 7 years, and I was doing everything right till it was 7 years old. And now I know what I did wrong. But in those days, I just thought the bird started to hate me because he had bitten my face and near my mouth. And when I say I did everything wrong, I really did a lot of things wrong. Undesirable behaviors that lead to the rescue, that's the most frustrating one because usually the birds arrive at the rescue and the condition is not happening anymore. And then I have a lot of friends that I know that have breeders, that have shelters, and you know, some of them say it, you know, it's very melodramatical to say that all these birds were beaten and abused, but most of the time they were hormonal. And these conditions stop when they get into a rescue situation where there's a lot of birds because a flock dynamic starts to be created and the birds are not in their territory. And so this is usually the reason why the birds start to change their behavior, not because they're no longer being poked and abused by their caretakers. Now, it's very, very important that we understand and that we respect the fact that they will want to breed. Every single species in captivity wants to breed. It's an innate desire to do so. And it's not something that we should completely take their mind away from 100%. But we can definitely change their minds. And if we keep them really, really busy and we do many other things, then that should help. The birds usually start bonding at around 7 or 8 months. At our facility, the Amazons start to bond with a new cage mate or a flock mate. And this is at the age where we don't want them to bond with a sibling. But this is also at the age where we see Amazons bonding to caretakers. So the fun fledgling age doesn't last that long. And all of the bad communication that we've created and the lack of mentorship and the overabundance of petting and preening and you know, everything that we do with the birds will have dramatic consequences at this age. Now, sexing is of the most importance, and we use several different labs for DNA sexing, and we often have to resex birds. And we take blood from the jugular and the metatarsal vein. When you take blood from a nail, there's higher risks of having contamination and having false DNA. But DNA is not 100%, and so ideally it's endoscopy. Or ideally, of course, when you have a bird that reaches maturity that is dimorphic, then we know. But more and more, there's mutations in a lot of the birds that we have in captivity. And it makes it even more difficult for us to ensure that we have actually accurately sexed these birds. That's the number one priority, is for you to be very well aware of the sex of your bird. If you're aware of the sex of your bird, you'll know nutritionally wise what this bird will need to have before it reaches maturity. You will also know how to behave as a flock mentor with this bird, whether it's a male or a female. And that's very different. And so this is very important. Many people, they just assume that the birds are a male or a female because of their behavior, because they're bonded to the man of the house or the woman of the house, or because they hate men. Or sometimes it's just because the female, the supposed male, has never laid an egg and she's 9 years old, so she must be a male. But that's not really the case. Now, that's probably the biggest mistake, is people thinking that because they've never laid and they're at an age where they should have laid. But what happens most of the time is that if the birds are under-exercised and they're fat, the little egg that leaves the follicle on the ovary will not be able to go into the oviduct and travel there and mature and come out as a viable egg. And this is where people have the most misconceptions. They think that because they'll never see a real egg, that the bird has never had ovarian activity, where it might have had so for many, many years. So what we recommend, again, is DNA sexing for sure. That's always what we do to start off with. And now it's very easy. You can send in feathers. You can use the eggshells, you know, right away when the birds are laid, if you're incubating these birds. We use a different DNA sequencing in Saint-Hyacinthe, in veterinarian school in Quebec, that is not even released worldwide yet, but is even more accurate. It's DNA sequencing, which is different than the typical DNA analysis that are done by other laboratories. But the best thing you can do is endoscopy exploration. And this is something that if you have a really hormonal bird, this is something that you should maybe explore with your veterinarian if this is something that's needed. And this is where you would be able to find out if your female that's never really laid an egg, maybe at one point had a viable oocyte, a very immature egg, that left the ovary but never made it into the oviduct, and then probably got reabsorbed in the body because the bird was healthy and it never developed into an egg-related peritonitis. But sometimes they do, and these are the ones that I think are definitely underdiagnosed. Males with a very large testicle that you can see on the left side there. This photo was actually taken from a very, very aggressive and territorial male. And it's proof. I mean, this is what's going on. And it's not because the bird wasn't well educated or anything like that. Why you need to know before the onset of the maturity is because you need to set yourself up for success. And this is very important before the birds become mature. And it's your responsibility. It's age specific, so you need to know a little bit more about each species that you have in your care. Like I said before, our Amazons start to breed at 3.5, 4 years old. Macaws can take 5 to 6 years old to breed. Whereas a Quaker will start breeding usually at about 12 months. So it can be very different. Like our children, it seems like it's getting younger and younger. And that's a little scary. Signs that your birds may be triggered. We all know what those signs are. Some of them are the most obvious, and we all have learned to recognize them. We get fearful of them sometimes because they can be aggressive. But other signs I'm going to be talking about you might not be so familiar with. Now, for sure, usually when the signs occur during seasonal hormonal peaks in the wild, then we're pretty sure that that's what's going on. Excessive screaming. I'm not talking about a scream that's usually calling out for a flock. I'm talking about a scream that's usually calling out for the caretaker, especially if this bird is a single parrot in a single caretaker's home. And this is something that can be extremely reinforced unconsciously by the caretaker, because we want to make sure the bird stops screaming, so we scream back at it, and then it becomes a screaming communication bonding thing. And this is one of the places where I see a lot of people are having problem with that. Panting when the birds are fondled, when they're preened. I think people know what that is right now, and more because we've seen so many problems with it. But some people, we see a lot of people when we go to bird shows that are still preening their Moluccan cockatoos while we're giving conferences, and the birds are panting, and nobody seems to know what's going on, or some people are just embarrassed to say it. But it is something that should be spoken with a little bit more truth. I think what's happening with the parrots is because they don't have any external sexual organs. People don't realize that when they're fondling them in this manner, they're actually masturbating them. So it's definitely not something that's conscious. I did it 25 years ago at my Moluccan. I mean, I would stop when he would start panting, but I mean, I didn't realize how bad it was and how negative it would have for the rest of his life. Excessive beak rubbing is also a sign that's very, very typical and that many people fail to recognize, is excessive beak rubbing. And it can be on the perches, it can be on the cage wire. It's usually around the entrance to the cage, because most of the birds that live in one cage all the time, day and night, they take that cage as a nest cavity entrance. So often you'll see that rubbing going around there, or where the bowls are flipped. So where you have the little doors and you bring in the food, and that's where the birds are going to start rubbing. And of course, regurgitation on toys. Well, the most notorious birds for that are the budgies. And Hagen was one of the first companies to sell the little plastic budgie, and the birds would all regurgitate on them. And back in the days, I mean, there was no issue with that. But when I worked in an avian vet clinic with Dr. Lupu in Montreal, we would see a lot of issues with that, because the birds should not be regurgitating year-round like this. So they would get problems with candida. They would get problems with their gastrointestinal tracts, because they're not supposed to be regurgitating year-round. Okay? Of course, tail fanning, head fanning, these are typical ones. It's not a picture that shows it dilating, but for sure, if you have a Senegal in your home, you know what that is, especially a male. Of course, the wings fanning, these are typical. Prancing and bopping. The regurgitation can be on mirrors, it can be on toasters, it can be on anything that reflects. But it can also be on branches, and it can be near the feeding dishes. And this is something that we see a lot. Now, if the birds have access to anything that mimics a nesting cavity, you should definitely take that away from them for a temporary time during the hormonal peak season. So anything that resembles a cavity can be a blanket, a couch, a cardboard box. It can be a tent. It can be your sweater. It can be anything in your home that the bird tries to go under. And when they're young, we train them to the towel. We like the birds to be towel desensitized when they're fledglings. But the minute that the birds start to reach maturity and become more juveniles, we have to be careful how we're using those towels. Allowing your bird to go in a transport cage is fine. That's how my bird got hormonal, because I was always traveling back and forth, and I had very different places where I lived. And my birds had an amazing, versatile lifestyle until I started being sedentary, and they had one place to live, and they spent so much time in that carrier. And it was very convenient for me, because when I wanted them to go in, they went right in. But they started using that as their nesting ground. And this is something that became extremely dangerous. Now, of course, birds that start to shred is something that you should be taking notice of. And shredding for me should never be where they sleep. It should never be near anything that they consider as their territory or their nesting cavity. If the birds start to shred, then give them something that's not destructible. Go to foraging toys at that point. Birds start to bite, whether it's between birds or whether it's with human flock mates. This is something that can be quite dangerous if the birds are fully flighted as well. So this is something. Now, these are little subtle ones that I'll tell you about, because that's how we know our birds are breeding. Increase in consumption and appetite. Usually it's females that start to increase appetite. Of course, the birds start to soak their food in their water dishes. This is typical of both male and female that will have that. More typical now of female birds will have the egg laying, will have the gain weight, because when they're going to be brooding their eggs, they're going to be losing weight. So instinctively they gain weight. They usually wet their rump in their water dishes, and this can be indication that perhaps there's a lack of elasticity in the cloaca, and they might have complications if ever they do lay an egg. This is what happens when we have an egg that's stuck in the oviduct, and it's often also related to less than optimal nutritional assimilation. So this is really important that you consult with your veterinarian to ensure that the birds don't have a lack of vitamin A, D, and E that increases likelihood that the egg will make it out of the oviduct. Now, somebody else showed a gory picture before, so I left it in there. Fat abdomen in females can be deadly, especially if the birds start to get hormonal. And it does happen. And this is a picture of a Quaker that tends to get obese on the abdomen. This is why some of them actually start feather damaging around the abdomen, we think. But if there's fat there and the little immature egg needs to fall into the oviduct and mature and get out of the body, it won't happen because there's fat blocking it. So fat cannot be in the abdomen for your female birds. It's very dangerous. The cloaca, you can just take a look at the cloaca. This is what it looks like when females are getting ready to breed. So we call it swollen cloacal lips, and you can easily visually sex a bird. I mean, if this is a male that they gave you back as a sexing result from your DNA sexing, get the bird sexed again. I mean, definitely. This is a very preoccupying one when we know birds are having problems with egg dystocia, is they usually start to pick at their left leg. Now, the reason why they do that is they only have an ovary on the left leg. And if they have complications with an egg coming down through the normal oviduct channel, then that's usually going to affect the sciatic nerve, and you're going to have a bird that's constantly picking, almost as if he's cleaning his nails or he's trying to preen feathers near his ankle. So this is one that should be, this bird actually was sexed as a male. Somebody had told them it was a male, but it was never really sexed, and it turned out to be an egg-related complication. Feather damaging behavior as well. For females, usually more around the crop and the hips, but it can be anywhere. Now, another cause of feather damage of hormones is lighting. Everybody knows about that. I think we all know about photoperiods and how this affects the hormones. LH hormones are responsible for breeding, and so for a fact, when we increase, especially full spectrum lighting, we definitely have more success breeding. 25 years ago, as a technician, it was really hard to sell a $65 full spectrum light when people came in and had problems with vitamin assimilation. In this day and age, everybody has full spectrum lights, and what used to be recommended as 12 hours a day has now gone down dramatically. So what was recommended mainly right now is about 5 hours a day of full spectrum lighting. That doesn't mean you keep your bird in the dark afterwards, but giving them more than that will definitely stimulate, especially species that are not used to being in the open sun. So if we're talking about how much full spectrum light an African gray should get versus maybe a parrotlet, it's very different. The birds that live in shrubs usually don't have as much exposure as the bird that would live in the savanna in the open sun. So you have to be very, very sure about, and write all of this down in your pet status files. We'll show you, we have some that you can download, but many people have them. Your veterinarian clinics usually have places where you can check off all these things and write it so that people can help you assess. Now, another thing that contributes, and I think this is the one that's the worst, is when you have a single caretaker with a single bird in a home. This is the most dangerous scenario because usually you will have pair bonding with this bird. And if you unfortunately start to not mentor this bird and start to allow to do all kinds of things like exchanging food with your mouth, like touching his commissures. The beak commissures are muscles that the birds have near the back of their opening of their beak, and breeders, we all know what those are for because we touch the commissures and the birds actually have a feeding response. But when the birds get older, these are sexual stimulators. Highly sensitive area of the beak that should never be touched by humans, especially not humans that do not wish to be considered as a breeding mate. And we see so many people touching the beak all the time. Stop touching the beak. You can't touch the beak. Touch the head. You try not to touch other parts that I'll show you, but the beak, it's complicated. Put your hand on the beak and kiss your bird on the forehead if you want, but don't touch the beak and don't exchange saliva. It's very dangerous for health reasons, but it's also miscommunicating to this bird that you intend to breed with him. We use a lot of towels to hold babies, especially fledglings, so that they get used to it. I really like the idea of using towels. And when we have birds that are sexually hormonally charged, especially birds that come in through rescues and we're asked to go help and evaluate health or maybe look at what's going on, then a wet towel always does the trick. A bird that's charged will go down dramatically right away, and you can practically do anything with this bird. And we're not whisperers at all. I don't like that word because, first of all, whispering to a bird and talking closely in his feathers near his ear is very sexually sensual. And if you have observed or you've ever filmed bears in nest boxes, they do talk to each other in this manner as well. So don't whisper too much to your birds. Don't exchange saliva. Don't touch beak commissures. Don't do these things when the birds are sexually. And this is the area that I'm talking about. Now, of course, when the birds are maturing, it's hard. It's not like when they're young. When they're young, they're swollen, the commissures, and they're very sensitive. But when they're adults, all adults usually touch each other's commissures before they actually copulate. And in the wild, you'll see them doing it all the time. Of course, any region near the tail and the vent, whether that's on the lower back or that's the front back, especially if we have a large macaw, we tend to preen the birds and then go down like this with our hand. We're masturbating these birds. We are. And it's not conscious and it's not bestiality because there's no sexual organ that's apparent or that can be touched because all of their organs are inside their bodies. But this is what you're doing. And like I said, if it's not happened yet, then maybe because the birds are not old enough, but it's eventually going to happen for sure. Under the wings can also be a very sensitive area right here. So take a towel. Now, this is what I mean. When birds whisper to each other, this is what they do. Now, let's talk about the other one, nutrition. I can't have fun with no nutrition. We're so boring. We have to feed the pellets only. And so we cannot give the enrichment foods that would normally stimulate birds to breed. So when you're in peak hormonal season, if you increase variety, if you increase abundance, if you increase the number of places where the birds can find food easily, you're contributing now to increasing hormones. So this is so boring, but like Robin would say, find many different ways of hiding that food instead of finding different foods to offer during that period. So for maybe 2-3 months out of the year, you might not be able to get your kicks out of, creating all those wonderful meals for your bird that have so much variety. But it's a small price to pay to ensure that your birds are not going to be excessively hormonally charged. And this is something that we feel very, very we're very conscious about the consequences that this will have. Now, additional to that, we want to make sure that we're not creating what we call in the wild trophic environment. In the wild, when everything starts to become ripe and when there's so much opportunity to forage, this is when the birds are confident that they can actually breed. And this is normally what kicks off the breeding season. If you're creating this in captivity because you're trying to be a good caretaker, like I said, try and find more convenient ways or more creative ways to make it more challenging for them. But you have to be careful also at the different nutritional value of the foods you're offering. So every caloric value is important. If you're offering your birds things that are too palatable or too fatty or too oily, this will also stimulate. So usually all the different pellet manufacturers have either the high potency, high performance. We have all different types of food that offer different caloric values and different fat content. And when you're in peak hormonal season and you don't want to have hormones getting out of whack, then you're trying to give something that has a lower. So when it comes down to your pellets, you're trying to find something that has a lower caloric value as well. If you're giving fatty seeds and nuts, find something else to reward your birds. Vocal praise are amazing. They're actually even more rewarding, and foraging alongside your bird is more rewarding, I find, than giving a treat reward. So there's many other creative ways that you can positively reinforce your birds than giving too much seed treats that will, in turn, just stimulate hormones. Warm foods, soft foods, warm water, they all stimulate breeding, without a doubt. I can guarantee you, because we use the warm water trick, and right away I'm going to get my Amazons into breeding. So this is something you need to be conscious about. Sugar in the diet. so many people give too much sugar. It's so hard. As manufacturers of pellets, we remove the sugar and we're so proud to write it on our bags. And then caretakers go out and give so much sugar. These birds are sugar rushed beyond belief. It's dangerous for their gonads, which are their reproductive organs. But it's also dangerous for candida, and it's dangerous for their behavior as well. So these are all things that should be avoided as much as possible to give during the breeding season. If you don't have enough foraging opportunity, then you're definitely falling into danger of creating hormones as well. So you need to have a lot more foraging opportunity. Don't exchange food with your mouth. What I'm doing right now with this bird is I'm actually eating my biscuit and I'm not sharing. I never share. Birds love it when I don't share. They have more fun finding foraging beside me when I'm foraging in my toy and they're foraging in theirs than if I start to exchange food with my mouth. This is something that we try and teach at a very young age. What birds don't have in captivity as well, if they're only a single bird in a home, is the hierarchy and the flock dynamics. World Parrot Trust and many others make these wonderful visual enrichment videos that definitely do help you to provide these birds in a single cage bird home a beautiful virtual environment where they're going to be able to see species of different species and see a flock of birds. And of course, try and not put the parts where it's just birds breeding. This is what we like to use to teach our young fledglings how to do it, but it's not something you want to do to stimulate. Now, if you look at birds in the wild, and if you haven't had the opportunity, do try and go on some of these conservation programs because the projects are really fun, and it makes us realize a lot how these birds are behaving in captivity. But when birds are foraging long distances and they're having more challenges to find and there's scarcity of food, then that's not usually when the birds are getting hormonal. The problem that's happening in captivity is what we're creating is a one cage where the bird has the food there, and usually it's a one caretaker that brings the food directly to the cage. And of course, we have to make it so convenient that the bird doesn't have to break his head, that the food is there all the time. So unconsciously, what we're stimulating is perfect breeding cavity environment. And most of the time, the birds are sitting on top of the cage. We manufacture these cages too, I must admit. We've also contributed to this in the pet industry, where we put play gyms right on top of the single dwelling home of the bird. Already that's a mistake. 2 cages, a day and a night cage. Absolutely. Even for a budgie, that's what we've been doing for 25 years. 2 cages. But then the worst thing is to allow our pets to stand all day on top of the entrance of their cage. This is what they're doing now to protect their nest cavity. But your birds are doing it to protect, not their cage, to protect their nesting cavity as well. So if you have only 1 cage, get a second-hand one. Get something else that you can actually make sure that your birds are sleeping elsewhere, because this is not natural for them. The only time in the wild that they would be doing that is for a few weeks during the brooding of the eggs, where the female will be catered to at the nest site by the male. After that, she starts to go away and forage every day with him too. So it's a very small period of time in the wild where the female has actually brought food to her. And we're doing this year round, so you can see. Now, the other thing that happens too, and we know this happens because we manufacture cages, and when paint goes missing on the inside of the door, then that's what's going on. Birds usually mark their entrance to their cavity as they will their cage. So if you see this is what's going on, change the toys around, change the branches around, remove all that preening, destructible material from the cage. Make sure you have a sleeping cage. Make sure that the bird has indestructible toys and he doesn't have all day. Just make sure you don't have a tent in there. Tents can be fine for some birds, but not for others. So if this is going on with your bird and your bird is getting aggressive and territorial in his tent, remove it. Give him something else. He's not going to die. He's going to be happy doing something else, but you have to give him an option. The blanket's the same. Now, what can be done to decrease hormones? This is all what contributes to it. Get your birds out. Get them to see other birds. Be careful with disease, of course. Make sure you côtoyer, that they see birds that are healthy. But you have to make sure that the bird sees that there's a real flock out there, and it's not just human flock. Make sure you have a night and day cage. I'm very firm on this because 25 years ago, we used to recommend that to budgies, lovebirds, and cockatiels. those are the birds that have the most problem with hormones and chronic egg laying. And in those days, there was not the injectable luprons. So we had no choice. We had to basically sell the people a second-hand cage so that they would do it. Because if you go to a pet store and they tell you, well, you have to buy a second cage, yeah, right. You're going to think the manufacturer, the pet store, wants to make money. But it's really making sure that, and a sleeping cage doesn't need to be very big. Birds in a sleeping cage have no activity going on in there. Usually there's just their pellets and a water dish. There's no toys. This is not where you want them to get entrapped at night. Big enough for them to spread open their wings and their tail doesn't touch and their head doesn't touch, and that's it. And usually when they come out of the sleeping cage in the morning, we monitor their weight. They step right onto the scale, and then we know for a fact if there starts to be a little bit of a weight increase and attitude, then maybe we're getting a little bit too much hormones. Get your birds outside. You would think we breed indoors, and we are unfortunate that we live in Quebec and it gets a lot of snow. And we always thought we were so pitiful that we have to breed birds indoor most of the year. But it's so much easier to breed birds indoors. When you go outside, there's hawks. We have fisher in our mountain that very stress out our birds. There's many environmental stressors, and there's a lot of things that make the birds a little bit cautious and always, looking out and checking. So they're not in a perfect environment to breed. Whereas indoors, everything is protected. They don't need coping skills. There's no stress. We made it perfect for them. Perfect lighting, perfect temperature, perfect environment. And we need to not do that. You need to really stress them out a little bit more. If you can, there's a lot of birds that do like other species. We raise all of our babies with different species. Our baby jandayas actually get raised by our Amazons, and the macaw is the one that's going to probably have to answer to the Amazon very shortly. Carriers, be careful, but take your birds out, but be careful with the carriers. They can become also a breeding cavity. The food, choose something that's lower calorie value and low fat, and increase all the foraging opportunities. If you don't believe in foraging because you've bought really expensive toys and they don't work, buy one for yourself. You always get 2 foraging toys, one for you and one for the bird. It works all the time. We did videos on our website of how to train birds to forage. And to be honest with you, they had never learned. They're only 10 weeks old and they don't know how to do it. I don't share. I get really intent. Wow, look what I found. And I eat it, of course. And this is the way the birds learn how to forage. So foraging doesn't have to be expensive. There's so many ways to do it with recycling. The more the challenges are difficult, the better it is for birds that have become very aggressive, very territorial. Make it hard for them. They can handle it as long as you're following and monitoring droppings and weight, of course, and health. Now, the other thing that this will do is will allow you to, if you increase foraging, you're more likely to be able to change the diet. And because you're going to be giving a lot less enrichment foods during those few weeks of peak hormonal season, not the year round, you can knock yourself out later, then you need to find interesting ways to hide it. We use cat scratch posts a lot. Cat scratch. We have a company called Cat It that makes really fun cat toys, but cheap cardboards that cats make their nails on. We shove all kinds of pellets into there and clay and a little bit of seeds and into these holes that are perforated in these cardboards that are so inexpensive. And we hang them. And it's so easy to make what we call advanced foraging. It doesn't cost $50 to buy an advanced foraging. Create it yourself. Just make sure that you do it too and that you show your bird how fun it is. We call it occupational therapy, is everything that the birds do to keep their minds off thinking about breeding. And it does work. It really does work. We use another cat toy here to do the foraging, and it allows the bird also to get out of its cage, because foraging in the day cage is not a good idea. You don't want the bird to be there all day. You need to make foraging stations for it. I'm not saying convert your whole house into a bird playground, but you can find very conniving ways of creating foraging boxes that make it a little bit more challenging for your birds. The kale, the green kale, is fine during breeding season. That doesn't seem to be stimulating a whole lot more. But if you have the parakeets and the books and the Australian parakeets and all of these, this will stimulate for sure, because they don't eat much other enrichment foods. But you can give them pumpkin seeds. You don't have to go with the sunflower. You can give them other things if you want. Diminish the light to about 5 hours a day of full spectrum. Increase exercise as much as possible. Outside as much as possible, away from their cage-bounded territory. and make them feel and discover new textures. Misting is the one that's always the biggest challenge. Does it stimulate or does it prevent? And I can tell you one thing. We have automatic sprinklers at Hari, and when I put hot water in it, I'm going to get breeding. When I put cold water, it's because I want them to stop, and I want to just be able to clean the aviaries. That's how we clean the aviaries every day, is we start a misting, and then we're able to clean our floors with the hose easier. It seems to be the same thing as far as we're concerned for companion birds. If you mist your bird with very hot water, and the environment is very hot and humid as well, and then you preen your bird, and you inadvertently, fondle him when you're trying to dry him with a towel or with the blower, then you're definitely contributing to stimulate him. But if instead you put the environment cooler and you actually use a warm hot water bottle still, because by the time you mist it, it's kind of cold anyways, but then you offer a basking opportunity instead. Basking lights are sold for reptiles. We sell so many basking lights through Exoterra, our reptile company, but we don't sell basking lights for birds, and that's always been confusing for me. Basking lights are what's going to stimulate your birds to self-preen. And if you don't offer that afterwards, then you're going to have to be able to preen the bird, or the bird's just going to sit there miserable. So that usually works well for us. And the other thing that we do when we don't want to stimulate hormones, we really, really wet them. Now, a Quaker usually takes about 500 mLs, if that means a good mist. And in wintertime at Ari, it's every day the babies get it, every day. And with music, and a little bit of video enrichment, the birds really get drenched. And when they're like this every day, then this is not breeding season. It's afterwards that it would start. So this, for us, works very well. Toweling these birds afterwards is perfect if you want to preen their head feathers if they're not preening properly. Look at their feet. Maybe they have bumblefoot. Maybe that's why they're not preening their head feathers. But this is something that works well for us if the birds are very territorial. They've become unmanageable. You're afraid of them. Get them into a wet towel. Pass them around your family. It's not right that you're the only person in the household catering to this bird. If he's only going to eat the enrichment food that you bring in the purple dish, you have a problem. Seriously. I mean, people would bring birds to board at the clinic all the time, and I think we saw more neurotic caretakers than a neurotic bird. The minute they would leave, these birds would see the other birds doing whatever, and we were able to change their diet. We were able to make them like being misted. It's really something that you need to think about. Enrichment videos are so powerful, like I said. Buy one of a different species. We have Quaker parakeets. They love the Australian World Parrot Trust one. They love it. And if we had the cockatoos, we would probably make them watch the South American birds. It's not true that the birds will only have enrichment watching their own species. They will have a lot of enrichment watching other species as well. And where this becomes handy is that the birds tend to not scream as much. When the birds are getting communication back from a flock, whether it is a virtual flock or whether it's from you, but you're not screaming and shouting back, then usually it comes down the intensity. And yes, I believe that birds should scream. I mean, they communicate in the wild when they raise in the morning and when they go to bed at night and when they're all gathering to roost. But they also need to do it at a certain level that you will not lose your home and that your neighbors will still continue to be good neighbors to you. Film your birds. Filming your birds is probably going to give you the most insight as to what's going on. And I can guarantee you that you can be the best caretaker in the world and you will not want to know the truth about how your bird perceives you, because it hurts. It hurts because we try to be good caretakers, and when we realize that the bird have fallen in love with us and we have become their sexual mate, we failed. And it's very insulting to recognize that. But I think you can change it around if you try and do all of these things. At least it's going to give you a good start to moving things along. But like I said, film your bird. Ask somebody that knows nothing about your bird to tell you what they see, because you're probably not going to be an accurate judge of what you see. Okay? And do it also when other people are there. The famous... my husband hates my bird. He always tells me that when I walk out of the house, the bird attacks him. People don't believe that's true. Oh my. I mean, I used to almost find it funny when I had roommates and my Moluccan would run after them, until I realized that it was actually so dangerous, what was becoming now a huge issue. So it's not a funny thing. It doesn't mean that the birds, if they want to mate with you, it doesn't mean that they love you forever. Amazons don't live together for life. After 5 years, they usually change mates. So if that's what's going on in your life and you feel very comfortable with it and you continue to make yourself believe that this is a perfect relationship that you've developed, one day you're not going to be hot enough for that bird and he's going to want a younger chick. And that's usually when the birds maybe bite you in your mouth. Because this is where the birds are going to bite you, is in your mouth. We have on our website new, and they're kind of hard to find. You have to go into health records. No product promotion here at all. There's no brands in here. You can fill this up with everything that you give your bird. It's like almost 12 pages for every single species that's there. This should be brought along with your veterinarian visit and with your behaviorist consultant because it can help people highlight what you're doing wrong. And this is something that I would recommend you do, as well as the mind and body chart, which is another one that's only for the behavior of the bird. And of course, you have to seek veterinarian advice. You need to make sure that you're absolutely certain about the sex of these birds and where your birds are situated within their life stages. It's hard to figure out what life stages are when we're a companion parrot owner. So make sure that you have that right. Make sure that you're completely aware of everything that you're doing in the environment. And if your bird starts to get hormonal and she's a female, you need to make sure that she's nutritionally sound. And so this is something that requires absolutely a veterinarian exam. Okay, so you're not going to get anybody giving you advice over the internet that is absolutely certain about the health of that bird. You need to have somebody check that bird out and make sure that the cloaca reverses, that there's choanal papillae that are healthy, that the bird has no issues with his reproductive organs. And that's it, because I've been told now that we need to get out. There's an hour-and-a-half video on our new website on the video section that's there. And it's an hour-and-a-half of hormones and how to deal with hormones. This was very short, but hopefully there's so many good information out there. We keep finding such amazing websites all the time that we go onto the web. So we're all very privileged to have all of this information. We just need to digest it and to actually start applying it, I think. Thank you. Oh, that's the harry.ca website. harry.ca. There you go. Just Google hormones. Okay?